Good afternoon. Can everyone hear me okay? Welcome to the Mendoza College of Business. My name is Peter Ashley. I'm the Director of Marketing and Communications for Mendoza, and I'm pleased to welcome you to the college and to today's lecture featuring Gerard Baker, the Editor-in-Chief of the Wall Street Journal. Here to introduce Mr. Baker today is his daughter, Miss Kitty Baker. Ms. Baker is a senior in Arts and Letters at Notre Dame, and for today we'll overlook the fact that she's an Arts and Letters student, graciously I might add, and she's also a news writer for The Observer. So would you please join me in welcoming Ms. Baker.
Thank you, Peter. Good afternoon, everyone. While I feel I could give an adequate introduction for my father, I thought I might actually begin with a few insightful tweets from his brief stint as a moderator for the Wall Street Journal Fox Business Republican debate last November. The tweets covered all aspects of him, from his looks. The British guy with no hair is winning this, I think. Hashtag GOP debate. His accent. We should just let the British guy say everything. He makes everything sound nice and cordial. His nationality. Gerry Baker looks like the suspicious British crew member turned villain in every sci-fi movie ever made. And what he has done for his country. British moderator ignores "let's get to commercial music," asks question, music fades. UK celebrates first win since the Falklands. Some were not so completely enamored with him, however, asking if he could perhaps have been someone else. Instead of Gerard Baker, maybe the debate should have had Gerard Butler instead. Just saying. While Gerard Butler would have been a fine substitute, today I have the great pleasure of introducing my father, Gerard Baker, the current editor-in-chief of the Wall Street Journal. He studied at Corpus Christi College, Oxford University, and holds a degree in philosophy, politics, and economics. Although at first he tried a short-lived career as an economist for Bank of England and Lloyd's, he finally found his true calling as a journalist, his first job covering economics at the BBC in New York, where he discovered his true love, the New York Giants. Quite the international, he has also lived in Japan, working as the Financial Times Tokyo correspondent, and then in Washington, D.C. as the U.S. editor and assistant editor for the Times of London. He finally moved to New York and the Wall Street Journal as the deputy editor-in-chief and has been there ever since. Please join me in welcoming the editor-in-chief of the Wall Street Journal and my father, Gerard Baker.
Well, thank you very much indeed. I really can't follow that, and I won't try. I can only say that there's probably one thing more humbling than being introduced by your own daughter to speak to such an august crowd, and that's being humiliated by your own daughter to speak in front of her. But thank you very much indeed, Kitty, and thank you, Peter. Kitty, I'm incredibly proud to be here with you. I can't tell you how proud you've made me over your short life so far, your very short and very distinguished life. And I am the happiest and proudest father there could possibly be, and to be here today makes me especially proud. So, Kitty, thank you very much indeed, and congratulations for all you've done. It's a great pleasure to be here at the University of, I'll never learn to pronounce it properly, I'm afraid I am English, but the University of Notre Dame, I think that's how you say it. It's wonderful to be here. I have to say, as an Englishman, as Kitty said, when Kitty first expressed a strong interest, a strong desire to come to Notre Dame, I had some misgivings. After all, this is the home of the Fighting Irish. And I am an Englishman. And a lot of the fighting that the Irish have done over the years has been directed at the English people, very successfully on many occasions, despite some of the things you may have heard about. Obviously some Irish jinx has got into the got into the sound system today, but it was when I came here and discovered football, actually, as Kitty says, I've long been a football fan, a New York Giants fan. I learned when I first lived in America that football was played with a different sort of ball from the way it's played everywhere else in the world. And I did learn, and I'd heard that Notre Dame actually had something of a football team, and I learned to discover the joys of college football, and I learned what a great team, what a great university you have. But much more importantly, over the last few years, as I've really come to learn about and understand and visit many times the Notre Dame community, it's a real extraordinary phenomenon you have here. And I am incredibly proud to be associated with it. It's been, you really have created one of the greatest educational institutions in the world. You have a great Catholic education. You've created a great Catholic education, a great community spirit here, great academic, both research and undergraduate teaching, and it really is a quite extraordinary institution. And as I say, I'm just incredibly proud to be associated with it. So congratulations to you for all you've done. And indeed, I must say also many great Notre Dame alums have come to work both in journalism but also on Wall Street, and I've met many of them. I've had the pleasure to meet many of them through the activity of Scott Malpass, the CIO here and your great professor in the business school. Scott really is one of the most extraordinarily successful, brilliant financial investors, financial people in the world, and it's been a great privilege for me to know him, to get to know him better over the last few years. What he's done for this university has been literally peerless, literally unmatched. So you should all be, I know you all are extremely grateful to him for his work, and I'm just proud to have been associated with him. Thank you, Scott. So, despite the fact that I am English, I am actually proud to say go Irish. So. And with that, I will start, as I often do, by telling you a little bit about my background. And when I speak to audiences, I often get puzzled looks, I can tell, because they hear that I'm the editor-in-chief of the Wall Street Journal, and they hear my accent, and they think there's something not right here. Why is the editor of America's greatest newspaper, the greatest newspaper in the world, based in Wall Street, why is it being run by some Brit? And I do often have to explain, actually, as to how that came about. And the only way I could really explain it is probably to tell you a little story that I think captures reasonably well the way we British still like to think of ourselves. You know, it's been a long time since Britain really was the top nation in the world. We were overtaken by the United States a long time ago. One of my other daughters always likes to say that the greatest thing that the United Kingdom did for the world was the United States of America. But Britain long since lost an empire and failed to find a role, as a US Secretary of State once said. But it's still true that I think too many British still sort of think somehow they do have a kind of global role, a global status, and we probably do have an elevated opinion of our own role in the world. And to illustrate that, I will tell this story that is a favorite story of mine, a joke. It's not true, but it could be, and it's about the British and about how the British see themselves. One day, God calls down from heaven, as he is right now, it seems to be. God calls down from heaven, and he calls on President Obama, President Xi Jinping of China, and Prime Minister David Cameron of Great Britain. And he calls them up to heaven, and he says, I've got very important news for you, and you better listen. The world is going to end tomorrow, and you need to get ready for it. So President Obama goes back to Washington, goes on national television, and says, I've got good news and bad news. The good news is there is a God, and we religious, God-fearing Americans have been right about that all along. The bad news is I've met him, and he's told me the world's going to end tomorrow, and we've got to get ready for it. President Xi goes back to Beijing, goes on national television, says to the Chinese people, I've got bad news and frankly even worse news. The bad news is there is a God, and we atheist communists have been wrong about that all along. The even worse news is that I've met him and he's told me the world's going to end tomorrow and we've got to get ready for it. Prime Minister David Cameron goes back to London, goes on national television and says to the British people, great news. God considers me to be one of the 3 most important people in the world. Anyway, that leads me directly to the topic tonight. the greatest and most important person in the world, which is certainly the most important person in the world, the president and the presidency of the United States. And I will speak for a bit. I'm very happy and I'm in fact eager to take questions and comments. You're all very much involved in this great democratic process this year. I think the Indiana primary is still coming up. Many of you will be voting here, I'm sure. And I have to say, I've been here in the United States for more than 20 years, and I've covered presidential elections. I think this is my 6th presidential election, and I can't recall a more extraordinary presidential election than the one that we are currently going through. You know it as well as I. It's a spectacle. Presidential election is always followed very closely around the world. I would say more people in Europe know more about the American presidential election than they know about their own presidential or their own political electoral cycles. But here this year, the attention is extraordinary. People are following this with a fair amount of interest, I would say some alarm, a lot of concern. You have this remarkable phenomenon, on both sides, not just on the Republican side, but on the Democratic side. On the Republican side, you have the field being led, obviously, by a political novice, someone, a complete outsider from the political process, who's been a very successful business leader and a television host, and a successful television host, too. On the Democratic side, though he's not leading, you still have someone who's making all the waves, who is an avowed socialist. I think the only avowed socialist in the Congress of the United States, who is calling for a radical redistribution of wealth and income along the kind of lines that socialists have done in Europe for a very, very long time. So you have an extraordinary phenomenon of these two candidates. Also on the Democratic side, you have the front runner, who is still the front runner, obviously, although she's being given an extremely tough fight. And there's still a certain amount of uncertainty about her future. As we know, she's being investigated over the emails affair and the risk, of course, that she still faces, that she could face further investigation and conceivably even indictment before the presidential election. So I can't recall circumstances where we've seen such extraordinary turbulence in the American electoral process. Certainly not in the last quarter century. And then on top of that, of course, it seems to be getting only more turbulent and more volatile. We've had these extraordinary events just over the last weekend, the cancellation of the event of Donald Trump's event in Chicago last week, a certain amount of violence that seems to be taking place at a lot of these events, protesters clashing with Trump supporters, and just this weekend, the rest of the Republican field rounding on Donald Trump and attacking him for inciting violence. So we're at an extraordinary moment. I think, again, most of us in our lifetimes, even the older ones among us here, have not seen events like this. And I'm going to try, and of course, tomorrow we face another round of primaries, really important ones, Ohio and Florida and Illinois and North Carolina, Missouri. Essentially, we could tomorrow, if Donald Trump is successful, he could come very close to essentially wrapping up the Republican nomination. And of course, Hillary Clinton could do the same on the Democratic side. So what does all this mean? What does it all portend? I'm not going to try and make any forecasts here about what's going to happen. I would not be foolish enough to do that. Since I confidently predicted a year ago in a setting not very dissimilar to this that Donald Trump had no chance whatsoever of being the Republican nominee, and that my audience had no need to spend any time thinking about that prospect whatsoever. So I'm well out of the forecast businesses. Sam Goldwyn famously said, never make forecasts, especially about the future. So I will refrain from that. What I'm going to try and do, though, just in 15 or 20 minutes, is just to try and lay out what I think is going on, what I think are principally the economic conditions that have led to this remarkable state of affairs that I think the United States finds itself in, but also to make the point that it's not just happening here. And that although obviously American politics are very singular, very much America, it's very much the American political system, we are seeing some extraordinary events elsewhere in the world, and I think they do have some really important things in common. I think if you look at what's going on in Western Europe, just yesterday you saw remarkable elections in Germany. Germany had state elections in 3 states yesterday, and a party that didn't exist 3 years ago, which has risen first in opposition to the euro and now most recently in opposition to the wave of immigration that's been happening, obviously, in Germany in the last year, secured almost 25% of the vote in one of the states in Germany that voted yesterday, from zero 3 years ago. These are extraordinary times. Later this year, in June, Britain, the place of my birth, will vote on whether to remain a member of the European Union. And I think right now, there is a very good chance that Britain will vote to leave, the British people will vote to leave the European Union. That would be a seismic event in European history. You're seeing in France really strong support for the far-right National Front Party, anti-immigration, authoritarian party, kind of a neo-fascist party in many ways. You're seeing in Eastern Europe governments that have been elected on a very, very nationalistic, anti-immigrant, anti-Euro platform. So this is a phenomenon, I think, this exercise in democracy that we're seeing where people are voting for parties that are either extreme or candidates who've been outside the political process. This is now becoming actually quite common in the Western developed democracies. And I want to talk about, I think, what are some of the circumstances that are giving rise to that. Again, without attempting to make any specific predictions. And I do think the overriding factor, you won't be surprised to hear this, is the economy. As President Clinton's campaign manager famously said in 1992, it's the economy, stupid. And I think it is the economy that is driving so much of the alienation, so much of the dissatisfaction that people feel in this country and around the world with their political leadership. Let me just cite you some data from the exit polls that we saw just last week in Michigan, where, of course, Bernie Sanders scored a shocking victory over Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump won easily in the Republican primary. The exit pollsters asked people coming out of the polls in Michigan whether they were worried about the economy, whether they were worried about the economy's future. On the Republican side, 93% of people said they were worried or extremely worried about the economy. On the Democratic side, 80% said they were worried about the economy. Asked whether or not they think trade takes away jobs, 55% of Republicans said they thought trade took away jobs, and 57% of Democrats said they think it takes away jobs. Asked whether they were satisfied or not with the federal government, 87% of GOP voters said they were dissatisfied with the federal government. And to me, a remarkable 68% of Democrats said they were dissatisfied with the federal government. Now, this is after 7 years of a Democratic president who has managed to implement many of the programs that he said he would, Obamacare, significant stimulus program, who has, by his own measure, whether or not you approve of what he's done, has by his own measure been successful in implementing much of his program. 68% of Democrats in Michigan said they were dissatisfied with the federal government. Now, obviously, many of them dissatisfied with the Congress and thinking about the Congress too, but I think that's a remarkable measure of the dissatisfaction that people feel. Now, of course, again, the driving force behind this, I think, does seem to be the economy. Look at those numbers that I mentioned about people concerned about the economy. We ask people, the Wall Street Journal, we take a poll every month, and we ask people whether or not they believe the country is moving in the right direction, or whether or not it's on the wrong track. For the last 10 years, with the exception of just 3 months, every single month, a clear majority of Americans have said the country is on the wrong track. Recently, the polling has been up to 65, 66% saying they're on the wrong track. The only 3 months when that wasn't the case were the first 3 months of President Obama's administration in 2009, and we then very quickly went back to people expressing dissatisfaction. So the level of concern about the economy in particular, about the country more broadly, is extreme. Now, why is this? And I think it's interesting that people feel even more strongly apparently now than, say, they did 4 or even 8 years ago. 8 years ago, remember, we were in the middle of the financial crisis. President Bush was coming to the end of his term of office, and there were the conditions in which President Obama was elected. But these numbers suggest that dissatisfaction with the economy is as high as it was then. And it's significantly higher than it was in 2012, when President Obama ran for re-election and won re-election. Dissatisfaction is now much, much higher than it was then, even though unemployment is lower than it was. The official unemployment rate, as you know, is below 5%. In the last year or two, the US economy has been creating jobs at a reasonable pace, over 200,000 a month. And the broader picture of the US economy has been growing, not spectacularly, but it's been growing. It's certainly been growing faster than the rest of the world. And yet now, as you say, people are deeply, deeply unhappy. Now, I think there are a number of explanations. I think the overriding and most important explanation, though, is that despite the fact that we have seen some job growth in the United States, unimpressive, but some steady job growth over the last few years. I think the overriding concern that people have is about the stagnation of middle-class incomes. And this, to me, is, having studied American history, both as a student and then since I've been a journalist for more than 20 years, this, to me, is the most remarkable fact about the US right now. The US has been the most successful economic machine in the history of the world. We know that. It's been extraordinarily successful at innovating, at creating jobs, and at growing. It's been far and away the most successful economy in the world, and it's been particularly successful at growing the middle class and enabling the middle class to grow, to prosper, and to emerge from the middle class and actually to be more successful. What we've seen, obviously, in the last 25 years is that progress has essentially stopped. The median income in the United States has not risen at all in real terms, in spending in today's dollars, has not risen in real terms since 1989. It's been up and down a little bit since then, but its real spending power today, or the real spending power today of the median income of American households, is where it was in 1989, that's a 25-year period which has not occurred before in American history. Even if you include the period of the Great Depression, if you take a 25-year period, except for the few years immediately after 1932, US incomes have grown, median incomes have grown, and grown generally quite substantially at an average rate of 1 or 2% a year, or sometimes even faster. There's been no growth for 25 years in median incomes. And I think that's probably the most important factor. But I do think another really important factor, and I think it's this that Bernie Sanders has done a very good job of tapping into, but even other candidates too, even on the Republican side, is that even as those wages have stagnated, median wages have stagnated, the incomes of the best off in this country have grown dramatically. So while median incomes since 1989 have not increased, the incomes for the top 5% have grown by 22%. Now that's the top 5%, that's quite a sizable chunk of the population. The incomes of the top 1% have grown by substantially more than that. We have seen, and again, let me give you one of my favorite statistics. And again, please don't think that I'm here judging or making a normative observation here. I'm simply giving you the data that I think explain a lot of what Americans are feeling as they vote this year. I'll give you one of my favorite data points, which is that the compensation for a chief executive officer, total compensation for a chief executive officer of a large company, of one of the top 1,000 companies in America, in the 1960s, the average CEO of that company earned total compensation that was about 20 times the average salary of one of his or her workers. In 2014, that number was over 300. The average CEO of a large company in the United States now earns, man or woman, earns over 300 times the average salary of one of his or her workers. Then again, I'm not making a judgment as to whether that's right or wrong. I'm simply pointing out at a time when median incomes have gone nowhere in 25 years, the fact that which would be, I think, problem enough in political terms, I think it would create dissatisfaction and alienation when they see that happening at the same time as the very wealthiest, the most successful, maybe deservedly, but they have seen their incomes grow. I think it leads to enormous anger and frustration, and they feel that the system has failed them. And I think in particular what they feel is that the leadership has failed them. So they look at these data, they look at these figures, they look around them, and they see a failure of their politicians who, after all, for 25 years have told them that the economy is good for them, free markets are good for them, trade is good, the advent of technological innovation is good, the US economy, if they work hard, they play by the rules, they will do well. And they see a system that doesn't seem to be rewarding them. Now, again, I think that's, without making a judgment on it, I think that's the overriding economic reason why people are so dissatisfied. Now, why have these trends taken place? And again, the really important thing to understand here is that this is a global phenomenon. This is not just the United States. Incomes in Europe have also stagnated. Now, they haven't been quite as low, they haven't performed quite as poorly as the United States. The median income in countries like Germany over the last 25 years has increased, and in the United Kingdom too. But what has happened in those countries, and it's a reflection perhaps of the way these different economies work, is that unemployment has risen substantially. So whereas unemployment, at least the official unemployment rate in the US, has come down, unemployment in most of Europe is extraordinarily high. And so that is the problems in Europe are being manifested by a complete lack of jobs, lack of availability of jobs. More broadly in the United States, the challenge is that there are jobs, but they just aren't paying people very well. People are facing real stagnation in their incomes. So this again I think is the key global phenomenon. And why is it happening? Again, these are very familiar reasons and familiar explanations, so I'll run through them very quickly. Look, I do think the obvious answer, the obvious most important first point is globalization. In the last 25 years, we have seen trade agreements. We have seen an extraordinary opening up of the world economy. We saw the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 and the emergence of China, essentially as a major player in the world economy at the end of the 1980s, the beginning of the 1990s. And what that did is that unleashed huge amounts of resources into the world economy that had not really been available before. And the combination of free trade agreements, which allowed the United States and European countries, the wealthy countries, to strike trade deals with many of these countries, and the emergence of these economies into the global system actually created this extraordinary amount of supply of labor in particular, but also of capital and other resources. And that drove down these prices. It drove down the price of labor in particular. And so you saw this situation whereby people in this country and in much of Europe and in Japan too, relatively high-wage countries, their competitive position was significantly impaired by the arrival of these low-cost countries onto the global stage. And again, I think this also explains why we've seen this growth in inequality. Because what the global system has done, what the globalization has done, and it's important to remember this, that even as inequality has increased dramatically within the United States and significantly, to a lesser extent, but still significantly in Europe, you've actually seen global inequality dramatically decline. The great benefit of globalization has accrued to, firstly, the very poor who emerged out of subsistence essentially in China and other emerging markets in the last 25 years. 600 million people probably in China alone went from literally a subsistence standard of living to a standard of living that's a kind of reasonable middle-class standard of living in the United States 20 or 30 years ago. It's a remarkable, extraordinary testimony to the success of the global economy and to the success of the market system that it's been able to do that. They undoubtedly have been the principal winners. But the other big winners in this global system have been the very best educated, the very most successful in the developed economies, in the United States, in Europe too. And it's created, I think, and again, I think this is a reason for this level of dissatisfaction in this country right now, it's created almost a global elite who have become increasingly detached from their own countries and increasingly see themselves almost as global citizens, as citizens of a world which they dominate, thanks to their education, thanks to the opportunities that they've had, thanks to the kind of businesses that they're involved in, their ability to move money, to move capital in particular, because a lot of this is concentrated in the financial sector, to move capital across borders, to essentially move around the world, to invest. The ones who've succeeded in the last 25 years have been, in the developed economies, have been the investing classes and the entrepreneurs. And they have seen extraordinary, because of the creation of a much more integrated single global market, they've seen extraordinary returns to their investment. And I think that's, again, why you're seeing so much inequality rising and why you're seeing resentment at it. The second big factor, I think, that is really causing economic insecurity here in this country is, of course, technology and the introduction of digitization. And again, it cuts both ways. Just as trade benefits a lot of people, and trade, by the way, even in the United States, trade doesn't just actually benefit the wealthy, as I just said. Trade obviously does lower prices, enables people to buy clothes and technology and various other goods and cars at much cheaper prices than they were able to 20 years ago. So there are benefits that accrue. But in terms of jobs, the jobs affected are relatively low-wage workers in the United States. And I think the biggest the even bigger challenge that we're facing, and I think, again, as I say, the reason why there's rising insecurity is this digitization, is the technology, is the rise of global technology in the last 20 years. This is nothing new, of course, in a sense. The advances of technology, waves of innovation that we've seen over the last 250 years have been a feature of the capitalist system. It's an incredibly vibrant, dynamic capitalist system that encourages investment and innovation. And we've seen that accelerate in the last 25 years with information technology in particular. But I think what it's unquestionably doing is creating an enormous sense of insecurity on the part of many, many workers. You know, we've seen factories increasingly staffed by robots, workers losing their jobs in factories. We've seen many, many simple tasks performed by computers now, whether it's whether it's banking, for example. Banking has been completely transformed by computers. I know not always to everybody's satisfaction if you've ever used your smartphone and been unable to get access to your account, but nonetheless, the advances that have been made in technology have been extraordinarily beneficial to most people, but what they've done is they've displaced enormous numbers of jobs. And again, let me just give you one data point to illustrate how much the new economy, as it's often called, is shifting resources and shifting away from high labor-intensive towards low labor-intensive, and that's this for the total revenues. You know, a company like Apple, which is obviously at the forefront of technological innovation, and compare that company with Caterpillar, which is also a company that's innovated enormously successfully in the last 20 years. But the average, the total revenues that Apple have for the whole company represent, divided by employees, so their total revenues per employee are 2.1 million. For Caterpillar, the number's about 390,000. Now, that obviously doesn't reflect their salary because there are other they use the money in other ways other than paying salaries. But that shows you how little labor is required to be a very, very successful technology company these days, in a very simple nutshell. And that is what's happening. And by the way, this is advancing, as we know. This is not just confined any longer to manufacturing, to robots replacing humans in manufacturing. It's getting to the point where with the rapid improvements we're seeing in artificial intelligence, we're getting to the point where we're going to see computers replacing all kinds of people, dare I say it, including journalists. Possibly not professors, although even there, in some respects, there is increasing amounts of work being done. And again, I speak seriously about journalism. There are some simple tasks now that actually my news organization does have done by automation. And over the next 10 or 20 years, I expect that to grow significantly. So all kinds of jobs that we previously thought were necessary, were part of the knowledge economy, and for which it was necessary to have an education and for a human creative mind to be producing, those jobs are being replaced themselves by computers. So this level of insecurity, I think, of globalization and digitization, again, it's affecting particularly the developed economy, and I think the level of insecurity is only going to rise. And again, I think it comes down to people dissatisfied with their leadership. So they see, even as their political leadership lauds the extraordinary growth that you've seen in the global economy, lauds global integration, and lauds certainly the remarkable improvement in technology that we've seen, and tells the people, has been telling people for 25 years, political leaders have been telling people for 25 years that these are good things and these are going to lead to great jobs. And of course, you know, waves of technological innovation and globalization have in the past been associated with global growth. But the problem is Americans right now are not feeling it. And it's important to understand that, and important to understand these data to understand, I think, what's going on. Now, I think I'd add one other just important element, of course, too, which is that these are the global economic conditions that are creating this dissatisfaction, this insecurity. But there are political factors too, and I think it's important not to lose sight of that. It's not just, again, as I said, that political leaders have promised great things from the global economy and failed to deliver, really, for most Americans in the last 30 years. It's also that there is a sense of political failure at a much broader level, I think, but this is particularly true in this country. A sense that in the last 20 years, for example, the United States has has lost its leadership on the world stage. That's probably not true, by the way, in objective terms. The United States is still the most important country on earth. It's still the most powerful country on earth. Its military is still significantly larger than the next 5 militaries combined. But there is a general perception, I think, beginning shortly after 9/11, the Iraq War, the war in Afghanistan, under President Bush, and then in the last 7 years under President Obama, a sense that the rest of the world, and this I think is what Donald Trump taps into brilliantly, a sense that the rest of the world is beating the United States in so many ways, whether it is Vladimir Putin taking land in Europe and assuming a leading role in the Middle East, or whether it's a deal like the deal that the United States struck with Iran, which many people feel was an unequal deal and represented a failure for the United States, or whether it is people see China rising and they see the United States apparently, if you believe some of the economists, the United States being eclipsed ultimately by China. There's a real sense of a failure of political leadership there too, and I think people are expressing, especially on the Republican side, are expressing great dissatisfaction with that. And then finally, there is also, and I think this is probably a global phenomenon too, again, at least in the developed world, there is this concern, which I think is understandable, of a loss of national identity and national solidarity. This is very true at the moment in Europe. Europeans feel that with this influx of it works on two fronts. Firstly, many Europeans feel that the euro, the creation of the euro, the ultimate realization of the European project, has actually resulted in a tremendous loss of sovereignty for individual nations. And this is certainly the sentiment in Britain. Even though Britain didn't join the euro, there's a really powerful sense that Britain has lost its national identity, has lost power to make its own decisions, has lost control over its own borders because of free movement within the European Union. And there's a powerful desire to take that back. You've seen it in Germany in the last, as I said, just yesterday, the growth of these parties, these anti-immigrant parties. Angela Merkel undoubtedly was doing something that was very compassionate last summer when she said when the Syrian and Afghan and other migrants first started to arrive in Europe, they could all come and Germany would find a home for all of them. But there are potentially 5 or 6 million people from a different culture, different background, very hard to check where they come from, hard to check who they are. Vast majority of them obviously coming wanting just to earn a living, but this is incredibly disruptive to a country, even a country of 75, 80 million people like Germany. And this is creating enormous resentment. It's creating resentment in France, where we've seen terrorist attacks, and in the rest of Europe too. So there is this very powerful sense that people have lost their national identity, their sovereignty, their ability to control their own destiny, and they want to take it back. And again, I think there are strong elements of that in the United States. I think this anti-immigrant sentiment that certainly Donald Trump seems to represent, but even some of the other Republican candidates too, does represent a strong sense on the part of many people in this country that the United States has lost control of its borders. They talk about 12 million undocumented aliens, illegal immigrants, and the need to deal with that problem. I think this is all associated with the rising sense of national identity, the rising sense of a decaying national identity that people have, and a desire to take it back. And it's allied, too, with a sort of resentment at the political correctness that people see in Washington and in Brussels, that says you're not allowed to think like that. You're not allowed to think as a nation. You're not allowed to think that you are better than anyone else, that you are allowed to have your country, whether you're British or whether you're French or German. You're not allowed to because you're part of an international system and you have obligations to the international system and to everybody else in the world. And there has been, unfortunately, I think it's true, a pervasive political correctness that has actually alienated huge numbers of people around the world, in Europe, but also in the United States. And Donald Trump, and again, some of the other Republicans are tapping brilliantly, I think, and rather successfully into that. So I think those are the broad economic and social and political conditions that explain what's going on. Again, I have no idea what's going to happen in the election, but I do think those conditions are so pervasive and so deep and so important that whoever wins the election, whether it's Donald Trump or another Republican, or whether it's Hillary Clinton or even conceivably Bernie Sanders, I think the powerful political forces at work are going to lead to a number of factors which I'll very quickly describe. I do think there will be a reassertion of national sovereignty and national identity. I think that does mean, both in the United States and in Europe, I think I would be I will not be surprised if Britain votes to leave the European Union in June, and I think that will begin the breakup of the European Union as the peoples of Europe seek to take back their own national sovereignty. I think, again, if you've got a Donald Trump or somebody else who wins the presidential election here, I think there will be a demand to deal with immigration. There'll be a demand to put America first more, as he would put it, or make America great again, dare I say it. I don't have the baseball cap, but if I promise to be nice to him, he's promised to send me one. But it will, that's very much a nationalist sentiment that I think will grow. I think that will mean that trade, as people talk about, I think whoever wins again in November, it will be extremely hard to get more trade agreements, to get more international economic activity through agreed trade agreements. And I think that's unfortunate, because I think despite the displacement that happens when trade deals are signed, in the long term it's beneficial for the global economy. But I'm confident now that what you're seeing in both political parties is a rejection of international markets, of international free trade, which is extraordinary. Over the last 50 years, presidents of both parties in this country have promoted free trade. President Clinton signed NAFTA, pushed for the World Trade Organization. President Bush originated the NAFTA negotiations, the first President Bush. President Obama, who's arguably to the left of President Clinton, has pushed for the signing and has agreed the Trans-Pacific Partnership and is trying to get it through Congress. I don't think he's going to succeed. But now, so you've seen Democrats and Republicans push for global trade. I think whether or not Hillary Clinton or Bernie Sanders is the Democratic candidate, that's not going to happen. And clearly the Republican candidate, as it looks likely to be, is not going to support global trade. In fact, it's probably going to support protectionist measures. So you will see a retreat from global trade. I think you'll see a tougher environment towards Wall Street, and one of the things I haven't talked about is anti-Wall Street sentiment. I think there's been a strong sense that Wall Street is blamed for the financial crisis that happened in 2008 and hasn't been punished hard enough. And I think you'll see that here, and again, I think you'll see that in Europe. Anti-bank sentiment in Europe is extremely strong. So I expect that. Look, I don't want to give the impression that that we are retreating into a kind of 1920s or 1930s. I don't think it's that bad. I think the global economy is too integrated already. I think people are too interdependent on each other. I think in the end, this country will not, even Donald Trump will not be able to achieve what he wants to achieve with international trade or with immigration because of the constraints of Congress and the broader international constraints. But I do think we are headed into a period where we can expect to see much greater assertion of national rights and of national sovereignty. And by the way, again, you're seeing that across Europe, not just in the British case or the French or the German case, but look at Scotland. Scotland voted, nearly voted for independence just over a year ago. I think that if Britain leaves the EU, Scotland will vote for independence. You've got Catalonia in Spain looking to break away. You're going to see this rising national sentiment, which I think in many ways could be good. It will bring power back to people, back control over their own borders, control over their own destiny. But I think it is likely to increase international tension in the long run. So look, I don't want to end on an overly pessimistic note. I think the US remains far and away the most dynamic, most successful economy in the world. I think it can take, it's had a hard time, middle incomes have had a hard time in the last 20 years. But I think with the right combination of education, the right investment, the continuing growth of entrepreneurialism, of the investment in the tech sector, the prospects for the US are pretty good. But I think the political climate is pretty difficult at the moment, and we can expect to see some more challenges ahead. But again, because I am an optimist, I will end with one of my favorite quotes from one of my favorite politicians, Winston Churchill, like me, an Englishman, but a great admirer of the United States. And Winston Churchill said at some point when he was exasperated with something that was going on in the United States, he said, the thing about the United States is it can always be relied upon to do the right thing, but only after it's exhausted every other alternative. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much indeed. And thank you for being such a wonderfully polite audience. I'm certainly not Donald Trump, clearly, because I haven't had to, there's no ejecting of any protesters. Now, I think we do have we have 15 minutes or so for questions, so please, I'm very happy. And there are microphones around. Please feel free to ask a question, make a comment, make an observation. Look, remember, I took a lot of abuse in that Republican presidential debate. I'm well used to it. You can, within reason, you can ask me or tell me what you like. Yes, there's a gentleman up there.
So the first part of your lecture sounded an awful a lot like a history lesson. As I'm specifically thinking of Europe and the American economy leading into World War II. Can you speak a little to that? And is that just with me, or is there something to it?
You mean sort of period post-World War II or pre-World War II? Post-World War II. Yeah, thank you. Well, first of all, I wouldn't dream to give a history lecture. I'm not remotely equipped, as as all your professors are, to give a history lecture. So I won't attempt it. But I take the point. I mean, I think the international system as it exists today was very much the creation of the United States, principally, far and away the most important, the principal victor in the Second World War. It created, but with its support, with its allies. The United Kingdom in particular, but also the rest of the NATO countries, Japan obviously, initially obviously under US rule, but then ultimately as an independent country. And the reason I think the international system was so successful in that period, firstly in averting peace, and secondly in promoting international growth, was twofold. First of all, you had the Cold War, and I do think this is one of the most important changes, which is we're only finally beginning to understand the implications of the end of the Cold War. It's 25 years this year since the collapse of the Soviet Union, and we are still experiencing, I think, the impact of the end of the Cold War on our own economies and our own political systems. I'm reminded of, I think it was a Chinese leader, whether it was Mao Zedong or somebody who was asked in the 1940s what were the principal effects of the French Revolution, and he said it's too early to tell. And it's a little bit like that now for us, just 25 years after the end of the Cold War. But the Cold War was extraordinarily important as a glue that held the system together, because it held us together because we feared, rightly and properly, the consequences if we didn't. We would, to coin another phrase, if we didn't hang together, we would surely hang separately if we were not together against the enormous Soviet threat. So that was powerful glue, and it created both political alliances within the West, including Japan, and it created economic unity to a very large extent. And it was very much a driver of that, and it was one of the important reasons that the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, the United Nations, the IMF, all of these institutions that were able to create it were designed to both hold the allies together initially, and then to actually grow, to enable them to grow successfully. So it was very important. That glue that held us together has now gone. I mean, we still face enormous threats out there, as we see every day, whether it's in the Middle East or potential threats from Russia and potentially China. But the existential threat that we faced for that period between 1945 and 1990 essentially has gone. And so that has loosened the ties. It's loosened the sense of alliance and solidarity between the Western countries. And that, I think, has had an effect too on the economy. I think on the international economy and the willingness to work together internationally. And I think the other thing that we've seen since the end of the Cold War is within our own political systems. So I think, again, the political system in the West was heavily defined by this ideological struggle between left and right. We had, in all countries, but particularly in Europe, we had parties that were, Western Europe was obviously allied with the United States, was pro-democracy, anti-Soviet, but it created an ideological divide. The fact that there was a Marxist system, fundamentally, just across the plain in Germany, which had claims, at least for most of the Cold War period, to work successfully and was producing a standard of living, created a political tension. It created parties of the left and the right, socialist parties, social democratic parties in Europe, and conservative and Christian democratic parties in Europe. And even to some extent that was reflected on a more diluted level in the United States between Democrats and Republicans, more left, Democrats being left and looking for redistribution and more social equity, and Republicans being more in favor of individual freedom. that system, I really think that's another thing that is steadily breaking down. I think that ideological divide is not as clear. For example, Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump, agree on trade. I mean, they basically agree on that. Many, you find there's much greater, even though there is much greater partisanship in the United States now, there's surprising levels of agreement on these two sides on some of these issues. So I think that one of the points I was making is that the collapse of the Cold War system has created a set of conditions both domestically and in the international system that are making this kind of radical change that people are talking about now possible. More questions? Yes, sir.
So you're starting to see almost a divide in the Republican Party between kind of the white working class males who are voting for Donald Trump and some of the establishment that's more pro-business. Do you see a potential divide or a great third-party turnout in this election, and what are the implications of that?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and you are seeing. First of all, you're seeing remarkable levels of turnout on the Republican side in this primary so far. It's an almost direct mirror image of the turnout numbers in 2008 when Barack Obama, Senator Obama, was running against then Senator Hillary Clinton. And Obama in particular obviously was extraordinarily, was an inspiring figure and brought many, many people out to vote. Now, this time around, you're seeing really literally similar numbers of turnout on the Republican side and to the Democratic side in 2008, and similar levels of the Democratic turnout this time around to the Republican side in 2008. So, and I think what's happening is that large numbers for the various demographic groups, as far as we can tell from the exit polls, seem to be turning out. Large numbers of them in all the groups seem to be turning out. So you're absolutely right. Donald Trump is doing extremely well among working class whites in particular. And he does least well, interestingly, among conservatives. He still manages to win evangelicals, interestingly, in most of the primaries. He does less well among people who consider themselves ideological conservatives, distinct from evangelicals. But otherwise, he wins all the other groups, and they're coming out to vote in large numbers. I think he probably also is, though, and the evidence seems to support this, that he is bringing out quite significant numbers of people to oppose him. Now, I don't think this is the problem that Rubio in particular, Jeb Bush had. I don't think there are many people coming out in great numbers to support the establishment. I don't think there is an enthusiasm at all for the establishment. People feel that the establishment has failed them. But there are people coming out, significant numbers coming out to support Ted Cruz. We'll be interested to see tomorrow what happens in Ohio, whether large numbers come and support John Kasich. But I think what's happening is, so you are getting somewhat differential levels of turnout, and I think you are getting high. Trump is bringing people to the polls, for example, who've never voted before, certainly not voted before in Republican primaries. He does particularly well, by the way, in states that have open primaries, where people can vote and register on the day to vote in the Republican primary, who don't have to be pre-registered as Republicans. So he's bringing out a lot of voters who haven't previously voted in the Republican primary, and it's kind of creating a countervailing force where a lot of more conservative Republicans are coming out to vote to try and stop him. More questions? Yes, you at the front.
Thank you. Thank you for your presentation. It was very nice. But so as somebody who wants to become a journalist and holds people accountable, I'd like to know how you and other journalists like Jake Tapper and Anderson Cooper and so on, when moderating these debates, how do you contain yourself from just standing up and saying, no, you are just completely wrong on that fact. When Donald Trump, as I'm sure that most of you people are rational human beings, when Donald Trump has close to 80% of his statements rated as mostly false, or pants on fire by PolitiFact, and he's spewing out this garbage on live TV 24/7, how do you not just stand up and say, no, you are completely wrong, you're inciting violence, you're saying things that are just factually incorrect, and just, revolt against this despicable language, and not to sound too,
I think you should get off
too
the fence.
opinionated in my opinion.
You should get off the fence and tell us what you really think about Donald Trump.
So I'm a first-time voter, big Bernie Sanders supporter, even though I'm sure, the establishment is very against him.
There's a lot of them here.
That's
but let me, so probably the first thing I should say is the one reason we don't do that is I don't want to get treated like that protester did at at one of Donald Trump's rallies. I don't want to get sucker punched in that way. Look, it's hard because you want to. First of all, I think it would be. I think you have to be careful as journalists. Look, there's so much disrespect and distrust. And by the way, I'm delighted you want to be a journalist. Did you say you did? Excellent. Thank you very much indeed. I'll come and shake your hand, and it's a great thing. It's a wonderful career, and I commend you for it, and I hope you do it, and I'm sure you'll be very successful. But I think you probably won't be on the Wall Street Journal editorial pages though with views like that. Or maybe, who knows? There could be a bit of diversity. We could do with a little bit of ideological diversity. It's not a bad thing. But no, I think look, journalists. We have to be mindful of the fact that a lot of people don't have a lot of respect for journalists right now, and Donald Trump is very good, by the way, at channeling that. One of the favorite parts of his kind of campaign act is to turn on the journalists who are assembled there and denounce them all as disgusting and appalling people, and it gets the loudest cheer that it happens at any of his rallies. So, look, I think we have to be careful not to be seen as kind of being gladiators, to be in the arena with Donald. The last thing I want, not because we're irrespective of what I feel about Donald Trump or what he's saying, but I think it would be wrong for the viewers and for the readers of the Wall Street Journal for me to be seen to be somehow engaged in a battle with Donald Trump. I think that I should leave that to the politicians, to the other candidates. They can do that. I shouldn't be there for them. So we have to be careful. But you're right. At the same time, it is important to hold people accountable, and I think part of the problem. Look, I think that. I said at one of the pleasant sessions I did earlier today, I do think there is a problem right now in this country and to some extent around the world, which is that it used to be the case that people would kind of accept agreed facts and disagree about how to interpret them. It's really hard now to get people even to agree on the facts. I mean, again, I quoted. I think it was Daniel Patrick Moynihan, or it was a leading figure in democratic politics in the 1960s or 70s, who said, you're entitled to your own opinion, but you're not entitled to your own facts. Unfortunately, you are now entitled to your own facts, it seems. I mean, people are able to say more or less whatever they like. And if you challenge that, you're seen as being biased and hostile and negative and critical and typical and disgusting members of the press. So it is a challenge. Again, you don't want to be out there fighting these politics. You don't want to be seen to be doing that, because I just don't think that's right. But they do need to be held accountable. And I think we as journalists need to do a better job of that. Probably have time for one more question, I think. Yeah, yes. Thank you, yeah.
Thank you for your comments. Going back, looking at the economic trends when you were talking about the wage disparity and that it seems to be happening not only in the United States, but Europe and China, where there's different political ideologies. Do you think if the scenario happens where you talk about countries being more independent and focused on their national identity, that will fix the economic disparity we are seeing currently? And if not, what do you propose would help fix that problem?
I doubt it will, because I think in the end, look, I mean, I think it's clearly what countries are going to, I think what countries are going to try, or certainly what at least they're proposing to try. And it's important you point, and you raise an important point, which I didn't actually, although it is true that globalization has reduced, it's true that globalization has reduced inequality between nations. Even in China, it's increased inequality dramatically. I mean, you now have an elite in China, in communist China, which is almost as well. In fact, I think I saw the data. In the last year, there are now more billionaires in China than there are in the United States. So the inequality in China, which is even greater because the poorest in China are still literally on subsistence levels. So I think you are, that's if we do, as I think we might, revert to a system of essentially of barriers, of trade barriers, not completely. I don't think we're going to have autarky. I don't think we're going to the world is going to separate into sort of completely self-contained economic units. But I think there is going to be a retreat from the global economic system. And I think, look, for a time, that might give people satisfaction. You might reduce some of the inequality. But I think you're going to do it around overall declining levels of income. I think history just shows that global economic integration, that open markets, free trade, does produce greater prosperity in the long run for everybody. Now, again, that I'm not saying there isn't tremendous dislocation, and we've seen it in the United States, and that was largely the point of my talk. There is dislocation, and there is a certain amount of immiseration, I think, that a lot of, that a lot of Americans and some Europeans are feeling, and I understand that. But I think over the long run, you have to address that by improving educational opportunities for Americans, by continuing to invest in the really important things that are going to lift those people out of poverty. If you try to do it by reducing inequality, by putting up barriers, I think history just shows us that you might be able to reduce inequality, but you'll do it at the cost of reducing overall levels of growth and perhaps even reducing overall levels of income. And I can't think that in the long run is a good thing for either for the US or indeed for the rest of the world. Well, I think I probably am out of time. So again, I just want to say thank you all very much to you for listening. Thank you for being here. I want to say thank you again to Peter. I'd say thank you very much to my wonderful daughter, who is a wonderful daughter and is a wonderful member of the Irish community. I'm actually finding it hard to say that, but no, it's a wonderful, and I am, by the way, half Irish anyway, so all my jokes about being English are moot. But thank you very much for listening. It's a great pleasure to be here.
Thank you. On behalf of the college and from Dean Wong, we want to present you a small gift. Thank you so much. It was a wonderful talk.
Thank you.
It's your own Make America Great Britain Again sweatshirt. So thank you very much. Appreciate it. Yeah. Thank you. It was wonderful. Thank you.